John chapter 14. Soon we'll come to the end of this chapter. We'll move to John 15. But again, today we're in John chapter 14, beginning in verse 15. And here we read, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever. Even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you. Yet a little while, the world will see me no more, but you will see me, because I live, you also will live. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, "Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" Jesus answered him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him and will come to him and make our home with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words, and the word that you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." When we come back to John chapter 14, we remember that we come at this pivotal point in the history of this time of the disciples. Remember, Jesus has been teaching since John chapter 10 that there comes a time when the shepherd is going to die for the sheep. He's been illustrating this by saying that greater is it that when a grain of wheat will be planted, and how much more will be birthed, will grow from it. And so when we look back at John chapter 14, remember that Jesus is preparing them for the day that he is going to die. And so we ask the question this morning, and how do we live in a world without our hero? Now, I'm sure as a child you had a hero or someone you looked up to or someone that you aspired to be like. Some of us, most of us, I'm sure, had a hero, whether it be a parent or a grandparent or someone you looked up to in the world, maybe a political leader or figure, someone that you desire to aspire to be like. So when we look at this world, if your hero is alive, great. If your hero is passed on, how do we live in a world without a hero? How do we go about our days experiencing persecution and pain and suffering and even death without a leader? Because when we look at John 14, we come to recognize very quickly that that's the life that the disciples are preparing for. Their hero is about to die. They're about to lose their hero. They're about to lose their leader. They're about to lose the one whom has been preparing them, who has been guiding them, who has been with them daily. So the question we go back and ask is, how do we survive without the person that we vastly look up to? When we look back at John 14, we can imagine that is precisely the thought process of the disciples. Their hero, their friend, their leader, their protector, the one who has provided food for them, has provided food from those who have been following them, the one who they have watched raise people from the dead, is now talking about dying and has been talking about leaving them. The hour has come, he says. The hour has come, the time has come for this seed to be planted. Remember what we just said in John 10:15. He says, "The Father knows, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." I lay down my life for the sheep. And we come back here this morning remembering that it is here that Jesus is teaching his disciples how to live when he is gone. Here, Jesus is teaching them how to begin the mission, how to be about the life of the kingdom when people are trying to kill them. Everything that we find here is how to be about, how to begin the mission, how to be about living a life of the kingdom when people are trying to kill you, how to be about the world, loving people when people are hurting you, when people are speaking against you, how to be about sharing the gospel, the message of the kingdom, as we know and throughout the Gospel of Matthew, while you are being rejected by the world. It is here in these last moments on earth that Jesus has devoted his time and his energy to these chosen followers whom he has said that he would make fishers of men in Matthew chapter 4. Now it is time to prepare them to go fishing. So as we come to verse 15, we notice a bit of a shift in the message. In verses 1 through 7, Jesus' message was that of remembrance. remembering. Remember his presence. Remember his promise. Trust that he is with them even though he may not be physically there. To remember that he is not leaving them. He will be with them and guiding them, just as the people of God have trusted God throughout all of history. To trust that God was with them as they journeyed out of Egypt. To trust that God's presence was guiding them all along the way. In the same way that to believe in him as they believed in God also. We see that in John 14 verses 1 and 2. To believe in the presence of Jesus is going to be with them just as they believed in God. He and God are the same. There is no difference. He is God. The person of Jesus is God. They have trusted God. Now they are to trust him. He is to be trusted. They will not be left alone. And while he may not be with them physically, it is to their benefit. Why? It is to their benefit because he is going to prepare a home for them. Remember last week we look at the language in verse 2. He says, I go to prepare a place. I go to prepare a home for you. And if it were not so, I would not tell you this. He is not to be thought of as a liar or someone who misleads us, but he tells us in verse 2, I go to prepare a home for you. I go to prepare this place. And he doesn't just go to prepare it for us, but he says, I'm going to come back and I'm going to take you by the hand and I'm going to bring you back home with me. So we trust in his presence in verse 1, and we trust in his promises in verse 2, knowing that he's going to prepare a home for us, and he's going to come back and take us there. We read in Revelation 21, this home is infinitely better than anything we can understand or comprehend in this life. It's something far better than we can imagine, something far better than we can think of or desire, and we get these pictures. He gives us these pictures. Why? So that we aren't consumed by things of this world, so that we're not distracted by what we see around us. And this is, and it should be a great encouragement for us all, for even as we sit here, no matter what our weeks have been like, no matter what our moments have been like this morning, God has been guiding us perfectly. He's been putting us in exactly the right places that we need to be. He's been guiding and directing our paths and placing us on the journey that he has directed for us. Even when we do not realizing it, he's orchestrating our lives for his glory and for our benefit. When you and I think that this is crazy talk, we remember that in this moment in John 14, he's prepared the disciples to be in exactly the right places in exactly the right time. We remember that he's talking in John 10 that the shepherd's going to die for his sheep. And then in John 11, what happens? He goes and visits his friend who is dead. John 10, he's talking about the shepherd's going to die for his sheep. The disciples might dismiss this talk because up until this point, he's been the hero of the moment. John 11, they go visit Jesus' friend, his dear friend. In John 11, we also find the shortest verse in all the Bible. Jesus wept. We think about the moment that Jesus is weeping and the debated moment of why he's weeping. Is he weeping over his friend who's dying? No, the reality of why he's weeping is over the sin and the death of the world. What's going on here is the reality that sin is bringing about death representing the separation of man from God. Why this all came about? Because of the rejection of God in the garden by Adam and Eve. And so here we have the reality of why Jesus is weeping here. But here you have this falling. We have this perfect timeline of events happening. Jesus in John 10 saying that the shepherd is going to die for his sheep. The good shepherd is dying for his sheep. John 11, we have this timeline coming into perspective here fully for us. And he comes and he confronts Lazarus at the tomb and says, get up. In John 11, and so then we begin to see the events continue to play out here, and they're celebrating a feast at Bethany, where he again begins to talk to them, my hour has come. We get into John 12 and 13, and he has the disciples alone in the upper room moment. They've traversed into Jerusalem. They go into Jerusalem. What happens on their journey into Jerusalem? He's held as king. He's held as a conquering hero. We see the triumphal entry, which really is one of the most sad moments in all of biblical history, if we really think about it, because here are the people who are hailing Jesus as king, who we know in just hours are going to be screaming, crucify him. And so you think about what's happening in the mind of Jesus in this moment here, as he's recognizing the face of the people. Jesus is not like you and I when we walk through a crowd or walk through Walmart on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday. You go through Walmart on a Saturday, you think, this is not the place to be on a Saturday. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't go to Walmart on Saturday or Sunday morning. You know what I'm saying? Thankfully, we're all here, but Sunday morning at Walmart's kind of crazy. You should not try it because you should be here, but it's just crazy. Unless you're in the deep south and Walmart on Sunday morning is empty because they're all in church like good church people are. Doesn't mean they love Jesus, just means they go to church, but that's a whole different topic. But it's crazy talk. So when you think about how you walk through Walmart on a Saturday or on a game day trying to get all your snacks and goodies ready to watch the football game, and you're walking through and you're just beelining it to what you got, you're ignoring the faces of people. Here, Jesus at the triumphal entry moment, he's recognized on the faces of everybody. It's not like he's ignoring it. He knows everybody and everything that's going on. And it's one of the saddest moments perhaps in all of biblical history, because here he knows that in just hours these people are going to be screaming, "Crucify him." So he goes from Bethany to Jerusalem on this triumphal entry moment, and here the disciples in their hearts are thinking, yes, our hero has arrived. Yes, this is the moment for him to be placed on the throne. This, emotionally for the disciples, this is great. Whereas probably, emotionally for Jesus, this is horrific. Because he knows this isn't going to end the way it looks. Whereas the disciples are welling up inside saying, for 3 years it's finally paying off. For 3 years this is finally going to end up in the respect and the honor that we think this is going to be. This is finally going to be a good thing. And then they get into the upper room. They're kind of sequestered with just themselves. And it's kind of them. And Jesus starts talking about death all of a sudden. And you're like, if you're a disciple over here thinking, hold on a second, Jesus. I mean, remember they walk into the upper room and the conversation happening in the upper room. Remember, we go back to Luke 22 for a moment, and as they go into the upper room after the triumphal entry, they're having a debate about who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And you think about that logically for a moment, and you think that's a decent conversation. Why? Because they've just had the triumphal entry. And so you're thinking, okay, we got the king here. He's been held as conquering hero. He's been held as king. And so now you have the disciples thinking, it's my turn to claim my spot in line here. You know what I'm thinking here? It's my turn to get in line. I don't want to be left behind when Jesus ascends to. I want to get in my spot here. I've been following him for 3. I gave up the nets back in Matthew chapter 4. I gave up the boats. I gave it all up. Now, as we're finally entering the moment when Jesus is going to be made king and is going to be put on the throne, the debate is who's going to be the greatest. So they're having this debate, and what happens here? Everything takes a bit of a darker turn when we see that Jesus quiets the scene in the upper room. How? Because we see in John 13, Jesus starts taking off his clothes and wraps a towel around himself, and he gets down on his hands and his knees, and he does the most obscene thing. So we go from the saddest moment in Jesus' life to probably the most obscene thing in biblical history, where Jesus gets down and he washes the disciples' feet. Now, why do we call it obscene? Because even in Jewish culture, they wouldn't ask a Jewish slave to wash the feet of each other. Because it's the most gross, nasty thing you can imagine. But here, Jesus stops the conversation about who is greatest, and he washes the feet of the disciples. He gets the gross muck and sewage and all the other things that are on the feet of the disciples, and he washes their feet. And so here we go from him being held as conquering hero to him on his hands and his feet and his knees, washing the grossness off of their feet. And the conversation continues to turn about him talking about his death. So we come into John 14, and the disciples have gone from greatest to death, and emotionally they're a wreck. And you and I would be too. They're a wreck. And so here he's saying, it's okay, we're going to deal with your emotions. But he says, notice this, he says, stop your emotions from going out. From John 14, verses 1 through 12, he's saying, stop, get your emotions under control. He's talking about it in an extremely human perspective. He says, get your emotions under control. Remember the promises. Remember who I am. Trust me. Trust me. And everything that we see happening from chapters 14 through 17 is preparing them and preparing us is how do we live in a world? How do we live in a world that's going to hate the followers of Jesus? How do we live in a world post-Christ? And understanding that he's preparing us and put us in exactly the right place, in exactly the right moment to follow him, to love him, and to be the conduits of the gospel of the kingdom after his ascension. So we come to understand here that he set us up to be here at the right time, at the right moment to follow him. So when we think about this, we can put ourselves in this perspective and say, he put the disciples and he was guiding their life in exactly the right places. Why? Because he orchestrated this divinely and sovereignly to be the way it needed to be for them to see the perspective fully. He starts talking about death. He raises Lazarus from the dead. He sees the triumphal entry. He stops the conversations about being the greatest. He washes their feet, and now he starts loving them in an infinitely understandable way so that when they encounter what's about to happen, they are most prepared to continue living life. Because the ministry of the kingdom really starts post the cross. Right? The ministry of evangelism starts post-cross. And so now he's saying, I've been telling you since Matthew chapter 4, I've been telling you since day one that I'm going to make you fishers of men. Now it's time, now it truly becomes time for you to really start putting together the rod and the reel, for you really to understand what it means to go throw out the nets, because now it's really going to become time for the ministry of the kingdom to start. And so he's been putting together the smallest and the greatest details for his glory. So that when they lose the person who's been the object of their affection, for the object of their love, even when they didn't understand it, they know how to move on. And so what we see here is that we can trust his presence, we can trust his promises. And it's when we come to this truth this morning that we find ourselves in verse 15. And notice verse 15. It's extremely direct. All throughout this display of love from chapters 13 to 17, he's extremely direct, but he's pointing us forward. And look at verse 15. He says specifically, if you love me, it's an if-then statement. It says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. It's not arbitrary. Our love is not arbitrary. But again, we remember the context of John 14. Jesus is 24 hours at maximum away from death. The mission here is to remind them of what do they love. Is their love about emotional response? Or is it about the active response of what Jesus is calling them to? We look at the cross and the crushing reality of what it's going to take on their faith. Is their love going to be a response to a death? Jesus is saying, if it's just about grief here, if your love is just something that I had you because I called you and you got to leave behind the grime of fishing and your previous vocations, we've got to get beyond that. Like if you're just in it for the gotcha moment and this has been a good 3 years, when the cross happens, if it's just about the emotional response of this has been good, the triumphal entry was good, post-cross, if it's just been about the emotional and the high of following me, that's not going to sustain you. Right? Think about that for a moment. If we sign up for something or if we come on for something, okay, so last year I hung out with the boys in the school in the they were second and third graders last year, right? I think so. Were they second and third grade? Yeah, they're now the third and fourth graders. And every second and third grade boy last year wanted to be a quarterback for a pro football team. You know what I'm saying? They love the idea of being a pro football quarterback, right? Because it's glitz, it's glamour, it's something they want to be. But when you start thinking about and you start talking about all the hard work it takes, everybody starts backing up a little bit, right? I'm sure a lot of us, when we were children, we had dreams of doing something crazy, but maybe you didn't think it, maybe you still don't think it's crazy, but we had dreams of going to the moon, being a firefighter. That's not that crazy, but you doing something. I mean, how many of you growing up in the space race generation wanted to be an astronaut? Like you wanted to do something, but then you start thinking about the amount of work it takes, the amount of schooling it takes, and you start thinking it takes effort. And here, what Jesus is saying is following me is not an emotional response. It's an actual thing. He says you have to, and you will keep my commandments. It's not an arbitrary thing. And so when you look at what's going to happen at the cross, we're going to find out if following me isn't about emotion or following me is about commitment. Right? It's got to be something here. He says there are no debatable options. And as we look down through the end of this chapter, we see that he continues to reiterate what he's talking about here. Look at verse 21. Whoever has my commandments will know that I am in my Father and you in me and I in you. Verse 23. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word. Verse 24. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. Why the directness here? Why the directness here? Why the message on love and commandments? When we think of love, when we think of how we love, or perhaps descriptions of love, we know that love can be an emotion. It can flow from emotion. But here in this moment, there's an abundance of emotion. We know the disciples are dealing with emotion. The disciples are pretty wound up at the height of not being with him anymore. They believe that this was their king who would deliver them from their oppressors, just as Moses was delivered the Israelites from the Egyptians. They thought this, but now the conversation is about death. And so Jesus is teaching them this is not about emotion. Jesus is pushing them beyond this. And so the love of Jesus, friends, point here, the love of Jesus is not about emotion. It is not about an experience. It is something that drives us much further than that. He says, if you love me, the emphasis is on if you love me, your love will lead you to respond. It will lead you to respond. If we only look at how love has been described through the Gospel of John, we find this. In John 3, verse 19, he says, people loved the darkness. So we look at descriptions of love through the Gospel of John. John 3:19 says, people loved the darkness rather than the light. And this is what they wanted. This is what they desired. They enjoyed it. They preferred it. They didn't love the darkness out of duty. They loved the darkness out of craving. He goes on in John 12:43, they love the glory of man rather than the glory of God. So two descriptors of love in the Gospel of John. John 3:19, if you want to go look it up this week, and John 12:43. They loved the darkness rather than the light. They loved the glory of man rather than the glory of God. They wanted it. So we begin to unpack what loving means. They longed for it. They craved it. This is what loved is. They desired it. Again, what are we loving? So what do you and I love? Do we love light? Let's unpack this a little bit more. Do we love light? Do we abide in light? Do we desire light above all else? This is going to take us to the commands question. Are our hearts and are our lives marked by our love for the Father, by our love for the one who's brought us to life? Is that truly what we crave, what we desire? Or are we honestly, when we ask the question of ourselves, do we desire the dark because we have found something, that there are things in this world that give us pleasure? When we honestly examine our lives, we talked about this back when we were addressing when Jesus says, I am the light of the world. We talked about this, we unpacked this. Do we truly desire light, or are we kind of the people who kind of straddle the line and says, I like light. Light is good. It seems good for me, but I kind of like what this is over here. And we find ourselves straddling the darkness because we found something that brings us some type of temporary pleasure. Whatever the sin is, the sin that we're clinging on to, whatever momentary fleeting pleasure it is, whether it be sexual, whether it be monetary, whether it be greed, whatever it is, like, is there something that we're holding on to? So the question we have to keep going back to is, what do you and I love? Do we love light? Do we abide in light? Do we desire light above all else? Are our hearts marked by light? Are we marked by love for the Father, by our love for the one who has brought us to life? Is that truly what we're marked by? Is that truly what we crave? That's a question that we have to answer for ourselves. We can't look at somebody and say, do I love the light? That doesn't work. We know our hearts. God knows our hearts. The person sitting next to us doesn't truly know our hearts. This is a genuine question that Jesus is posing here. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Are we truly stepping out of darkness and into light? Are we truly falling more in love with Him and walking away from our former ways? When Jesus has brought us from death to life, are we walking away from the death that clung on to us? Or do we find ourselves enjoying and being tempted by the things of the dark? When we go back, if you want to turn there, you can. Matthew chapter 5, we find the Sermon on the Mount, beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the introduction per se. He begins to say, he says, He opened His mouth, Jesus being Him, and He taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who are meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Notice verses 13 and verses 14 specifically, though. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. These things that Jesus gives us here, these statements do without fail describe the nature of followers of Jesus, the fishers of men. The truth here, friends, is that if we are the salt of the earth, salt being an agent, get this, remember, salt being an agent that expels putrefaction being rot, a preservation agent, then we ourselves cannot be actively rotting. Okay, think back through that. He says, you are the salt of the earth. When we talk about this, in light of what Jesus is saying to us, if you love me, you will keep my commands. And then he says at the very beginning, the first sermon he ever gives, so we're looking at the first sermon, and we're looking at his last command 3 years later. He says, if you love me, you'll keep my commands. The very first thing he spoke when he called his disciples, right after he says, I will make you fishers of men, the very first thing he says is, you are the salt of the earth. If we understand that rightly, he says, if you are the salt of the earth, in this context, he says, salt is expelling the rot of the world. You're expelling the darkness out of the earth. Does that make sense? So if we are salt, we can't both be expelling rot and at the same time be rotting. Does that make sense? Do we get that? We can't ourselves be inwardly rotting while we're trying to expel rot at the same time. It doesn't work. The science doesn't work. The teaching doesn't. We can't do that. And then he goes on to say, if we are the light of the world, being that we are reflecting him, and we're going to get to this morning, the light is being reflected because of him being in us. If we are the light of the world, being that he is reflecting his light through us, and we are the light of the world, reflecting the light to the world, if our lives are conduit of that light, then we cannot have darkness in us. It matters. Because if we are the light of the world, being that his light is in us, shining out, then there's no more pockets for darkness in us. And you say, well, that sounds great. So you're saying I'm either completely encapsulated by everything that's right, or else I'm not a follower of Jesus. Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. Because if we remember our study of 1 John 2 this past summer, it says, when we sin, we have an advocate in him. So it's not saying that we're perfect. It's saying that we're not actively participating or seeking out that which is wrong. It means we're not standing in darkness and putting our hand over here and saying, I want it, I want it. It's not, we're not craving it. I think the perfect definition here is what we see is we're not craving it, we're not seeking it, we're not loving it. Remember John 3:19 and 12:54. We're not going over here and reaching it. Because we can't be doing that and claiming to be salt and claiming to be light, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work. John 14, 24 hours before the death of the king, we must remember the message here is a message of moving forward. And we must remember that the message here is holding the front lines. We're not going backwards. When the world comes on the offensive, Jesus is saying, you obey my commands. Think about this. When the world comes on the offensive against us, when we believe our life is falling apart, when we believe that everything around us is crumbling, when we believe that our personal lives, our work lives, our vocation, our dreams are crumbling, are we not in those moments most tempted by whatever vice is in our life? And Jesus is speaking to the disciples, says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Jesus is speaking in a very direct way at the perfect moment, saying, when you see me hanging on that cross, when you see them take me off of that cross, when you see me in that tomb, when you feel like everything has gone wrong, if you love me, you will keep my commands. You don't go backwards. We don't go backwards. When everything seems to be going wrong, we don't go backwards. When we're faced with temptation, when we are oppressed, when we are emotional, when we take a loss, when we are in pain, we do not give in to temptation, but rather we remember the commands of the Father. For here is where we must ultimately remember that the commands of our Father are not commands meant to oppress us. Think about this. In our culture, we think of the words command and we think of oppression, but the commands from the Father are not commands meant to oppress us. They're not meant to limit our freedoms. They are meant to free us. They're meant to bring us ultimate freedom. They point us further to the kingdom. They point us forward. They point us homeward. And it is there that we ultimately find our freedom. It is there that we see Him. It is there that we remember that everything that we have, everything that we experience in this life is orchestrated by Him. And it is in just that exact way that He is guiding us and directing our paths. The commands of the Father point us to remember what Paul is praying when he prays in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 18. He says, having the eyes of your heart enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you. What are the riches? Get this. Hear these words. Ephesians 1:18. Look it up this week. He says, what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of His power toward us who believe? Friends, when we think that we have lost it all, when we think that everything is falling apart, Paul is praying the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints. Friends, we get an inheritance far greater than anything we can understand. Why would we want to go backwards? Let us remember back in Revelation 21 about the home that He is preparing for us, a home and adorned with every jewel and everything that we can ever imagine. It is far greater, friends. The commands do not limit us. They point us forward. They remind us of where we are going, whom we are serving. They keep us from rationalizing in the darkness into our lives. And the commands point us to continually go back to the Father and remind us of the Father's love for us. Remember, this keeps us from going back to what we saw in Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve are rationalizing with the serpent, saying, did God really say? And they say, well, maybe, perhaps. Did God really say? Well, I don't know. And they take the fruit, and here we are. Is that not what we do in our daily lives? Did God really say? Well, I don't know. Let's ask a friend. Phone a friend. Did God really say? Oh, I don't know. Let's look at phone another friend. And then did God say, look? Let's look at the commands of God in just John alone. Just John alone. If you want to write these references down, you can. If not, we'll put them online later this week. John 1:12, a command of God. Really hard to grasp. One of these that's going to be really hard to follow. John 1:12, He says, receive me. 2 words, receive me. John 1:43. 1:43, He says, follow me. John 5:8, this is my favorite. Get up, crippled man. John 11:43, this one gets better. Rise up from the dead, Lazarus. John 12:36, believe in the light. John 14:1, believe in God. John 14:11, believe in me. John 15:4, abide in me. John 15:7, ask whatever you want. John 15:9, abide in my love. John 20:22, receive the Holy Spirit. Friends, these are the commands of Christ that we find just in the Gospel of John. Receive, follow, rise, believe, abide, ask, abide, receive. That's good. They're not meant to oppress. They're meant to point us towards home. They're meant to point us towards freedom. He says, and notice what he says after the period here in verse 16. He says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever. There's not a change of tone here. It says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper. When we love him, we will keep his commandments. For those who love him, he will ask the Father, and he will give us another helper. That will be with us forever. The commandments do not limit our freedoms, but rather they give us access to him. We can remember our study of 1 John 2 and recall that we cannot claim to love God if we do not keep the commands of God. That makes us a liar. If we claim to love God, we have to keep his commands from 1 John. John goes back and reiterates that for us. We keep his commands, we get him. The words here are massively important, and I don't spend a lot of time claiming to know Greek or teach Greek or going back to the original language, but here the words show us the depth of the meaning that English doesn't quite get. So stick with me here for just a moment, and I'm going to try to do this breakdown in Greek. So hold on with me for 5 minutes, and we're going to do this in the Greek for just a moment. Look here at the words. The word for helper here. The word here, when he says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper. Look at this. The word here for helper is the word parakletos, which can be translated to mean helper, yes. But it can also be translated most regularly to mean the word advocate. Remember that. Remember the word advocate here. It can mean advocate, friend, comforter, but most often this word means advocate, which is hugely important to remember. So hold on to the word advocate. So Jesus is going to send us another advocate. The Greek word here used for another, look at this. He says, I'm going to send you another helper. Look at the word another is the word allos, which can be translated to mean the identical. Now, it's important that we understand the word identical here. Identical means what? A replica of. Right? And not meaning something that's slightly variation of, but identical to. Okay, so let's make sure we understand identical. Most of you know that without the help of contacts and or glasses, like I can't see what's sitting on this thing. Like it's just not going to work for me. We're going to do this all from memory. So if I went to somebody and said, I need glasses that are identical to this, they would have to be the exact same lenses, the exact same prescription, and probably the exact same frames. Identical means an exact replica of. No variation, no change, no variation of color, the exact same everything. You know what I mean? It's exactly the same. No variation. Are you following where we're going on this one? So he says, I'm going to send you an identical advocate. Oh, that's where we're going with. So if we read this with the understanding of the original language, we read that if we love Jesus, we will keep his commands. And when we love Jesus and keep his commands, he will then send us an exact identical advocate to be with us forever. Now we've heard this already somewhere. So if we push this aside and not dwell on the Greek, but rather recognize the importance of the words, he says, we recognize that this is something that we have heard and we've studied already. 1 John 2:1. My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. The promise Jesus is giving the disciples at the moment in this highly emotional and stressful moment is that as a result of true love, as a result of following him, you get him, all of him manifest in you. He says, I'm going to send you an identical replica of me to be in you. Catch the magnitude of the moment here. He says, I'm not going to send you a variation of me. I'm not going to send you somebody who's like me. I'm going to send you an exact replica of me to be in you. We get all of him. He's going to be manifest in us. It's not a temporary thing. Notice this. He says it is forever. Jesus is not just part of our lives. God is not just part of our lives. It's not just a segment of who we are. When or if we are brought from death to life, we don't just do this on our own. But the promise is that Jesus is giving the disciples, the promise is given to us as followers of Jesus, that we get him. The Holy Spirit is an identical replica of Jesus living in us, and He is going to be with us. Notice what He says later on in the verse. He is going to be with us forever. At the end of verse 16, before you get to verse 17, to be with you forever. And I don't know how you define forever, but forever to me is a long, long, eternity long time. We go back to Matthew 28. The Great Commission says, I will never leave you. It's forever. And we will go back very quickly and remember what we have just read at Paul's prayer in Ephesians 1. We have our hearts enlightened that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you. What are the riches of the inheritance of the saints? What is the inheritance? The Holy Spirit. That is it. We get Christ in us. This is the literal meaning of Colossians 1:27. To them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Friends, the magnitude of the Trinity is massively important to our faith. It's not just some part of our faith. It is massively important to who we are as followers of Jesus. We don't need to write it off because it's hard to understand. It's not some spirit or some mist. It is the Spirit of God Himself living in us. It is in us, Christ in us. This is the message of the gospel. This is the message of hope. This is how we are the light of the world. This is how we are the salt of the earth. It is not based on who we are or what we can do. It is based on who He is and what He is doing in us. It's based on who He is and what He's doing in us. This is our hope. This is the hope of the world. Christ working in us. The message of the gospel going out from us. This, friends, is why the fruits of our lives are true evidence of our faith. Jesus points that out in Matthew chapter 7. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. Why is this so important? Why does this make more sense now? Because the Spirit alive in us is the source of fruit. Even for those of us who had no green thumbs to speak of, it's okay. Because the Spirit is the one doing the gardening in our lives. He is the assurance of our salvation. He helps us in our weakness in Romans 8:26. The Spirit convicts us of our sin and points us to righteousness. In John 16, not just to us, but also to the world. Friends, the assurance is that we do not live this life on our own. We have an advocate. We have a comforter. We have a friend who is with us, who is always present. Always, friends, no matter the circumstances of this world, we can trust in the promises of the King in verse 18, and we should always remember who He is. If we, and this wasn't in the plan, but if we look at Acts 2, and we recognize what's happening and the importance of what happens in Acts chapter 2, we recognize on the day of Pentecost when the Spirit comes down, we see everybody thinks that everybody's drunk. Why? Because the Spirit comes on the day of Pentecost. It rests on them as they're sitting in the room. They begin in verse 4, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now they were dwelling. And in verse 15, these people, Peter speaks, says, these people are not drunk as you suppose, it's only the third hour. But this is what was uttered through the prophets. And he begins to preach. And how does this happen? It's because the Spirit of God, Jesus is dwelling in them. The whole Trinity is active in and through them. Why? It's not based on who these men are or what these men can do. It's not about their faculties. It's about the fact that God is alive and at work in them. So friends, every time we say the word, I cannot do blank in following Jesus, we're saying that the Spirit of God is not capable of doing this. We're limiting who and what God can do. And I say it. It's a sin. I'm sure we all say it when we say, I cannot. So therefore, God cannot. Right? That's inevitably what we say. Because if we have truly been brought from death to life, we don't just go about our previous lives the same way. Why? Because the Spirit of God himself is in and alive in us. Being that we are transformed, and we're not the same people. The way we talk, the way we act, the way we interact, the way we do life is different. Not just because we had an emotional thing. This is not about emotion. This is about the fact that a part of the Trinity is alive and dwelling in us. Therefore, we can do things supernaturally different because of who and what God is doing in and through us. And we think about this and we realize this in light of what's happening in context of John 14. Jesus is saying to them, I am going to die soon. Soon and very soon. The mission is about to begin about how you do life, and the mission is not about you. The mission is about how God is going to continue to do his work on this planet, and about how the gospel is going to go out. Matthew 24:14, the gospel is going to go to all nations and all tongues and all tribes. And then the end is going to come. How does the gospel go forth? He uses people, but he uses people through the Spirit working in the people. So he's using himself to take the gospel. And we're the conduit of that. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. He's using himself to be the light of the world through us. Through us. But notice verse 18, and this is the verse that we should post on our cars and on our mirrors and whatever. He says, I will not leave you as orphans. He says, I will come to you. Yet a little while and the world will see me no more, but you will see me because I live, you will live also. And in that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. And friends, as Jesus looks to the cross and as the disciples become keenly aware of what awaits in the coming days, the words of Jesus cannot come with more weight. He says, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you when you are persecuted, when you are alone, when you are beaten, when people seek to kill you, when the world has more questions than answers, when you have no answers, you are not alone. You have not been left alone. He says, I will not leave you as orphans, but we are, friends, we have been adopted as children of the King, as sons and daughters, as princes and princesses of the King. Notice these words here. We are not left alone. This life is not about who we are, what we can accomplish, or what we can do. It's about who he is, what he is doing, and how he is redeeming his world, and how he is calling his children home. Notice what he says again in 1 John 3. He says, see what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. Let's pray together this morning.